Despite COVID-19, tough crippling sanctions, and diplomatic isolation, the Islamic Republic of Iran is continuing with its nuclear program, trying to cut down the time it will take to break out to a bomb when and if it decides to make one sometime in the future. Will a nuclear Iran pose an existential threat to the state of Israel, or is there a balance of power that can be achieved between these two countries? Anna Ehrenheim, the Jerusalem Post military correspondent, will moderate our next panel.
Good afternoon, and thank you both, Mr. Ross and Mr. Yadlin, for what's going to be a very interesting panel on the threat posed by Iran and how much time do we really have left. Mr. Ross, thank you for joining us by Zoom from America. And you were the former special assistant to President Barack Obama, and you have a lot of experience and knowledge in the threat that Iran poses then and now. And I have some questions for you regarding the threat that it could pose, especially in terms of American sanctions. Now, have American sanctions pushed Iran to be more aggressive in the region?
Look, it's an interesting question. American sanctions obviously have created enormous pressures on the Iranians, at least economically. We see great stress within the country. In response to your question, what's interesting is when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, in 2018, for 1 year, the Iranians really stayed within the JCPOA and began to move marginally away, but not in a dramatic fashion. After a year, and specifically in May of 2019, when the Trump administration revoked the waivers for 8 countries that were given waivers to be able to continue to buy Iranian oil, it was at that point that we then saw the Iranians become much more aggressive in the region. They never stopped, but they became determined, it seemed, to create their own counter pressure on the United States by putting pressure on American interests and American friends within the region. So I think what we've seen is Iran has not become less aggressive in the region. There was a period where they tried to create their own counter maximum pressure policy. What we've seen is Iran today not only does not respect any of the limits, with one exception of the JCPOA, meaning it continues to allow the IAEA to come in and monitor, but it doesn't respect any of the other specific limits on their Iran nuclear program. And we've also seen them now install 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges, something they weren't allowed to do until 2025. So their know-how is greater than it would have been. The stockpile of enriched uranium is, again, not respecting the limits of the deal. The level of purification to which they are enriching doesn't respect the limits of the deal. So at this point, both in terms of their nuclear program and in terms of their behavior in the region, we've not seen a change, even though we know the Iranians are under great stress internally, economically. And we also see that its model for the rest of the region looks less and less attractive, particularly with Lebanon being a failed state and Hezbollah being, in a sense, a major source of responsibility for that. Both in Lebanon and in Iraq, we also see Shia communities demonstrating against Iran. So I'd have to say that Iran's position in the region isn't changing for the better, but its behavior in terms of destabilizing and being a threat is also not changing for the better.
And Mr. Yadlin, I'd like to bring a bit more conversation to that threat, that aggressiveness that Mr. Ross spoke about. And Mr. Yadlin, as the executive director of the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, you're also very well aware of what's happening in our region. And has Israel's war between war campaign, that we call it here in Israel Mabam, has that pushed Iran to be more aggressive? Or has that pushed Iran to even perhaps attack Israel in the cyber fashion?
I think the Iranians, the formula of their operation, of their strategy, is how to deter for Israel, what you say, Mabam, the campaign between the war, how to revenge, how to deter Israel from continuing without escalation. This is what they look for. And the problem is that they want very much to be more aggressive, but their capabilities are limited. They want to do it from Syria, they want to do it through proxy, they don't want to start a full-scale war. So cyber, in a way, can answer to their demands. It can be without taking responsibility, deniability for their activity. It's not that escalating. And on the other hand, it should deter Israel. However, when we saw them attack in cyber, we were not impressed. And they took the wrong target. They attacked civilian infrastructure, the water system of Israel. They failed because Israel has a very, very good cyber defense. And somebody attacked Iranian civil infrastructure and, only as a signal. It was the main port. And Iran, I think, rethinking whether cyber is the right domain to fight with Israel.
And to what extent, this is a question for both of you, Mr. Yadlin and Mr. Roth, to what extent are Iran's regional ambitions responsible for the recent announcement that we saw last week, this historic deal that Israel and the UAE were normalizing relations? Mr. Roth?
I think you have to put this in a context. The fact is that Israel and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, have had a quiet relationship for more than a decade. I can tell you that when I first came into the Obama administration, early on I was invited by the Emirati ambassador to see him, and he had a suite at a hotel, and when I went there, who was there with him but the Israeli ambassador? This was their way of communicating to me. They had a very common view of the threats in the region, starting with the Iranians. So there's been a reality, mostly non-visible for a long time, of a convergence of strategic threat perceptions and a convergence of interest in terms of countering that threat that has existed for a while. The particular breakthrough now, obviously it relates strategically in the region, but what really drove it more than anything else was the Emirati understanding that the only way to stop unilateral Israeli annexation of the territories allotted to it under the Trump peace plan was to give the Trump administration and President Trump specifically a reason to say no to Prime Minister Netanyahu on going ahead with the annexation. That was the triggering event here, because you've had a relationship that has evolved over time and even had some elements that were visible. You have an Israeli office that was part of the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi. You've had you've had sports competitions where Israelis participated. So there's been a kind of relationship that had certain visibility, but it wasn't turned into something like what we're seeing now, which is formal, peaceful relations, normal relations. The trigger for that had much more to do with the issue of stopping annexation, and then realizing at the same time that the UAE could get something for itself as well, which was access to weapon systems that's been denied. If it was at peace with Israel, the same restrictions on preserving Israel's qualitative military edge would be different than they had been. A country that's at peace with Israel is treated differently than one that is not, even if that country is a partner of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Yadlin?
If I go back to your question, whether Iran is the reason for this deal, Iran is part of the reason. Because Israel and the UAE are sharing some common values, some common interest, and after 20 years of informal relation, some trust. And that's what you need. The Iranian case is coming into the interest. Iran is threatening Israel and the UAE as well. Iran's aspiration to hegemony in the Middle East is a source of concern for the UAE and for Israel. And Israel and the UAE are standing not only against Iran, also against ISIS, the radical Sunnis. The Iranians are the radical Shia, and even the Muslim Brotherhood, that the UAE are seeing as an enemy, and Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood. Second is, can Iran spoil the deal? They can't. And this is interesting because the UAE is standing in the open and saying, this is our interest, this is our values, and Israel and us are sharing the desire to be very advanced societies, very advanced economies, using technology for the time when there will be no oil. In Israel, no oil, never. But one day they will not have oil. So the Iranians cannot threaten them. And we see it after the fact that who were unhappy from the deal? Iran, Turkey, Ramallah, Hamas. So, the Prime Minister have said that he haven't shared the secret of the new relation with his defense minister and foreign minister because it would have been able to leak to the Iranians and they will spoil it. The good news is that even if it would have leaked to the Iranians, they don't have the political power to stop it.
And will this normalization between the UAE and Israel enable Jerusalem to be able to successfully push back against Iranian aggression? Mr. Ross?
Well, I think the fact is Israel has already been doing that. The UAE has already been doing that. I think this is not what you're taking in a sense that was in the shadows. You're gonna now put it in the sunlight. And I think Amos's point is important that the UAE decided to be very public about this. Now, part of that was because they defined it as being in their national interests, and they're saying that very clearly. They also knew from their own polling that a majority of their own public would be accepting of this. Does it make them more capable of pushing back on the Iranians? I don't think it changes qualitatively that, but it sends a message to the region that it's okay to do these things in public, and Iran's ability to really push back is limited, or at least they can't do more than they've been trying to do anyway. Now, I do believe the Iranians have an interest in trying to demonstrate that there's some cost because they don't want others to follow this lead. This can formally change the strategic landscape in a way that, again, begins to remind everybody that Iran is the odd one out in the region. Iran is not able to gain hegemony over the region, and there is strength in numbers in terms of resisting it. So I think as a broad principle, this is something that can be very positive in terms of it's immediately changing the character of what Iran can do and can't do. The reality of what the Israelis and the Emirates were doing already existed, but now it's been taken taken out of the shadows and brought into the sunlight.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Yadlin, do you have anything to say on that?
I think Israel is not building the strategy vis-a-vis Iran on its new deal with the UAE. The UAE is a small country, and Israel is building its own security on itself. And the superpower ally, which called the United States of America. If we think about a regional alliance, the core of the regional alliance beside Israel is Saudi Arabia. But the question whether the Saudis are joining is still to be seen. I think they are waiting, like everybody else, to the election in the US. Who is the next president? Who is the next administration? How the next administration will craft the strategy in the Middle East? Whether Iran, what the Iranians will do. So I think for now, vis-a-vis Iran, a coalition, we have to wait for the Saudis.
And I want to bring that point that you made about the upcoming U.S. elections, which we're seeing, and it's happening in November, so not too far away. Mr. Roth, do you think that Iran is counting on another term of U.S. President Donald Trump, or do you think that they would prefer a leadership under Biden?
Well, I think that right now they're waiting to see what the election is going to produce. With Trump, you have President Trump saying recently that he would reach a deal with the Iranians within a month if he were reelected, which is rather interesting because he hasn't reached one in 4 years. But what it signals is that he's always wanted to do a deal, and I think one should recognize if he is reelected, he'll have a strong sense of vindication. I'm not sure that anybody who would work for him will be able to stop him from pursuing something with the Iranians. The question is whether the Iranians will be prepared to deal with him. My own sense is that it would be difficult for the Supreme Leader, but it doesn't mean that they won't do it, because I think the internal pressures at a certain point economically will argue for them trying to do a deal, but they may try to do it through someone else, meaning have the Russians be a kind of go-between. In any case, I think where they are today is, yes, would they prefer to see Biden in? Yes, not because they think it's necessarily going to be much better with him, but they'll come in and say, we're owed, you owe us. We didn't pull out of the deal. The Trump administration pulled out of the deal. So I think that their strategy or tactics would be to come in and say, you owe us. I think what they're going to find is that a Biden administration would say, we're prepared to relax sanctions, but you're not in compliance with the agreement. And therefore, you have to come back into compliance with the agreement. And by the way, because you've built more know-how than you would have with some of your, by installing these advanced centrifuges, we have to reach a new set of understandings. Anyone who thinks that there's going to be a rapid turnaround, even if there's a change in administrations, what will be different is you'll for sure see, I think, direct diplomacy resume, because the Iranians will use it to try to get sanctions relief. Biden administration will want to show they're different from the Trump administration. They're much more likely not to start with the Iranians, but to start with the Europeans, meaning the British, French, and the Germans, to establish a common position, and only then move into diplomacy, direct diplomacy with the Iranians. So, in answer to your question, my guess is the Iranians are hoping for a change simply because they think it may give them leverage. I think they're likely to be surprised by that. And I think they're also, I think, as I said, if Trump is reelected, Trump is very likely to try to seek some kind of deal with the Iranians. My guess is they will hold out for a while, but in the end, turn to somebody else to be a go-between.
And Mr. Yadlin, as we wrap up this really interesting panel on the threat posed by Iran, with the win by Trump, with the win by Biden, Israel is going to continue with its Mabam campaign, the War Between Wars campaign. Do you think here, though, with elections probably coming up for the fourth time, do you think that Israel will step up its campaign against Iran? Or do you think that it's going to continue the way that it's been going so far? And has there really been any achievements from it?
No, I think the achievements are huge, because Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian penetration to the Middle East, to the Levant, has a plan. And according to the plan, in 2020, he should have Air Force base, Navy base, air defense, all kind of military advanced capabilities in Syria. And due to the Israeli campaign, if he is looking from hell into what is happening on the ground, he sees 10% of what he planned. So there is a huge achievement. However, it is not 100% success, because the Iranians are determined to have some capabilities, advanced military capabilities in Syria. And the question is where we're going from now, because there are three risks in the campaign. There is a risk of losing airplanes. We have lost airplane 2 years ago. There is a risk of hitting Russians, which are not our enemies, but the Iranians and the Russians are involved together in Syria. And there is a risk of escalation. Israel handled these risks very well. The question is how we can continue to achieve the same level of achievement without paying a price.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mr. Roth, Mr. Yadlin. Thank you so much for joining me. It was a very interesting panel, and I'm sure our listeners learned a lot. And hopefully the threat posed by Iran is one that, like you said, Israel will be able to continue to deal with and to deal with successfully. And thank you both so very much.
Thanks for having me.